And welcome everyone. Thank you very much for coming to our panel discussion today on artificial intelligence. So I think we've definitely in the Russell-Cooke team found that you can't really open a newspaper or go to a dinner party without hearing about artificial intelligence, its effect on the world, how it's going to end humanity, or the quite frankly soap opera dramas of those who are leading the developments in this sector. But we wanted to convene an expert panel and have a discussion on the potential impacts on the charity sector in particular. So how could we potentially harness this for good, but weighed up against the ethical considerations that I think charities more than anyone else will be expected to take into consideration. Now, I referred to an expert panel, and we're really grateful for everyone here today to share their knowledge and time and share that with the room here. So to introduce the people we've got speaking today, we've got Ian Alsop, who is a freelance editor and commentator on the charity sector. Ian has spoken about, written about AI and its philosophical implications for the sector, and we'll be able to bring that perspective today. We've got Mark here from Adapter Consulting. Mark is a senior consultant in digital data and technology, and Adapter Consulting specialise in advising charities and not-for-profits on technology, providing independent advice on that. We've got Zoe, who is the founder and director of Zoe Amar Digital, which is a social enterprise working with charities on their digital matters. Zoe is also chair of the Charity Digital Code of Practice and has recently developed an AI checklist which the Charity Commission was involved in the user testing of. Finally, we've got Chris Rouse, who, like me, is a partner in our charity team at Russell-Cooke, so advising charities on all sorts of legal issues, governance matters, but has also sat in the more difficult seat to hear today because he's been involved in developing Russell-Cooke's artificial intelligence policy, because like all sectors, the law sector is one that is also grappling with how to integrate AI into our systems and procedures. So that's our expert panel. To kick us off, and very much coming from a not expert position, can we start with what is artificial intelligence? What are the parameters of what we're talking about here? Lots of terms get bandied around like large language learning models and all sorts. Who would like to start with what's the kind of definition of what we're talking about today?
I'll try. I think there's different ways you can think about it at a kind of most meta level. You've got narrow forms of artificial intelligence, which probably represents everything that's going on today. And if you cast yourself forward into the future, you get closer towards this, human-like intelligence or general human-like intelligence, and then potentially superseding later in time. If we take all the forms of narrow artificial intelligence today, it can be useful to categorize that. I find two perspectives particularly useful. One is to break that down into what we call predictive or decision-making AI. So examples of that might be, for example, when you train the machine to diagnose someone through MIR scans, for example, that you might have a certain type of cancer. So it's trained on masses of data and can make decisions. And the other type of AI that's caused a lot of the hype recently is generative AI. And this is quite different because it can create. And that's what's really, I think, taken the world by storm. But there's another way of categorizing AI that can also be useful, which is to think about AI from an internal point of view. So AI that faces up to staff and helps them with their productivity and assists them in their work. And then there's AI that can be used outside your organization. It's facing in front of your beneficiaries and supporters and is used in society. And I find both of those sometimes useful to ways of categorizing AI.
Thank you. And I suppose having had that definition, and so we've got an idea of who's in the room for the rest of the conversation, could you raise your hand if you're currently using AI in your personal life? And if you're currently using it in your professional life? And if you've never used it at all?
Well, not knowingly.
I think that's a key point, isn't it?
Yeah, not knowing it. I know, Zoe, you were talking about just the expanse of AI into our personal life that we possibly don't know about.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's the next Sorry, so I think the definition you came up with is really excellent. And what I'd build on that with is that AI is really anything where you're using computer to learn or kind of mimic how a human would learn or solve a problem. And all of this technology is all around us. So if you opened your phone, for example, using facial recognition, that's AI. If you've used behavioural biometrics, which is where you might go to your banking app on your phone and use the put your face in the frame feature in order to do a bank transfer, that's AI. If you are using Amazon to buy a book and you're looking at those product recommendations, customers who bought this also bought this, that's machine learning, which is a type of AI. So these technologies are all around us, and exactly as you said, sometimes they're not seen, are they? So if you have applied recently for a remortgage, for example, or a loan, it's very likely that the decision that was made in order to decide whether you got that loan or not will involve a form of AI. So that's the thing, isn't it? Where we know these technologies are being used or not being used, and how transparent we expect organisations to be about them, which I think is a big issue for the charity sector.
Absolutely. And I suppose we've done a survey within this room, but I suppose a bunch of people who turn up to such an event may be not representative. How widespread is AI use in the charity sector at the moment?
There's been some surveys done. I think one from the Charity Digital Skills Report, which is about 27 out of 100 using AI. There's been some other stuff. It's usually around a quarter. It depends how you frame it. This is the problem with journalists like myself. There was, on the same report that someone had done, one person said a quarter are using it or considering it, and another one framed it as 3/4 aren't, which is kind of the same thing, but it was a difference in emphasis. So I think it does come back to what has also come out of some of these research things is lots of charities possibly want to use it, want to engage with it, and it's about time as much as not understanding it or being frightened of it, which I think is that's the headline you always get. There's this, we can't engage with that, we don't understand it. But I think it's taking the time to understand it. So I think it's obviously grown in the last year, but a survey only captures so many people.
Just to add to that, I also suspect there might be a bit more use in certain charities than the charities themselves acknowledge or realise, because lots of individual members of staff in different capacities may well be using it and integrating it into their work in some way. So it's quite difficult to get a sort of handle on the full extent of the use from that perspective.
And I think that's why one of the reasons why Chris was developing a policy for us to keep a handle on that. But I mean, I suppose in order to motivate people to take the time to use AI, Zoe, Mark, you've worked with charities and implementing. Do you have any success stories that people can come back and say, look, this charity has implemented it in this way, so people can think about things to emulate or kind of replicate?
So I've got some examples of charities who've been using AI, and I do want to say a lot of charities are at really early stages with this stuff, and you shouldn't feel bad if you are just starting to explore this. Everyone's at different points. So there's an amazing young people's sexual health charity called Brooke, and what they are doing, and this is currently in development, so they're not super far down the track, is they're using AI for two things. So the first thing they're doing is there is apparently a really high rate of teenage pregnancy at the moment, which I didn't realise. And what they're doing is using AI to provide quite a sophisticated service via chatbots so that they can target young people and give them personalised advice about contraception, and also make sure they can access contraception really easily. So that's a very nice example of where you're using AI to achieve your vision and mission. And the second way in which they're using it is to combat some of the misinformation and disinformation is out there. So what I didn't realise until I was speaking to them about the project they're working on in that area is that there's an awful lot of fake news about reproductive health on channels like TikTok, and people giving really unreliable information about reproductive health. So they're out there trying to combat that and make sure that people are getting the right information at the right time in a way that feels really relevant to them.
I can maybe add a bit more to that as well. Yeah, they're good examples of using AI to directly support maybe your mission as well. I'd say we're also seeing is probably more common people trying to use AI to support revenue generation. So AI is being supported to, more advanced propensity models to help select people for fundraising purposes or for marketing purposes, and also being used quite increasingly by marketing teams in terms of helping to generate content. We also see examples of organisations even using it for HR purposes to help create job profiles, for instance, or even help you decide what questions to ask at an interview. But I would agree that although lots of people and charities are starting to explore the potential of AI, actually the majority are only at the very start of that journey, and it's really the innovators that actually have specific use cases they're building and piloting now. Most examples of AI really down to individuals using ChatGPT for their own job, mostly. I'd say that's the most common thing.
Yeah, I think there is a distinction, which you've alluded to, between charities that are using it as part of their mission. So we'd have someone like British Heart Foundation, who had quite a high-profile thing about predicting heart attacks 10 years in the future. So that's using it to fulfil what they're there to do. And then you'll get examples like Parkinson's UK, who are using it for fundraising generation, which you mentioned as well. So there are those two distinct things. But I think, a lot of them are very, very early on in the journey, and they actually stand out because they are sort of quite unusual. I guess as well, no one's going to want to hold their hand up and say, this has been great, until they know it's worked.
Yeah, I'd say there's very few proven use cases where AI has been deployed in production for, say, 3 years, and the impact of that has been properly assessed through some evaluation study. So there's almost none of that at the moment. It is early, and much of this technology has only been released in the last year, let's remember, so there hasn't been that much time to really prove this.
Mark, you've already mentioned ChatGPT, which is probably the thing most of us in the room have played with, if we've played with anything. Are there any other kind of popular, more accessible AI tools that charities or their staff might be using to do that increased productivity, the kind of internal piece? Or is ChatGPT really leading the way on that?
Well, a lot of the generative tools are based on large language models. It's the same type of technology, but there are various flavors of these models on the market. So ChatGPT is the famous one, released by OpenAI, and also powers all the Microsoft tooling. But there are other variants, other models that have been trained on different data sets and have different characteristics in terms of the transparency and the citations and the rest of it that they offer to you when you use them. So some, like Claude, for example, which is a competitor, was deliberately designed to be more transparent and support more ethical use in the marketplace. So you do have different GPTs you can use in the market. Possibly the most excitement, I'd say, though, is all the technology that Microsoft is releasing. Most, or at least in Adapter, most of our clients use Microsoft Office in some way or another. And the Copilot technology that Microsoft is releasing is exciting. I think a lot of organizations, and that is mostly staff-facing technology, and allows you essentially to converse with your internal Microsoft systems quite easily. So rather than search your SharePoint, you can talk to your SharePoint library. You can start to talk to your HR system if it's Microsoft. You can talk to your CRM. Start to have conversations with your business systems rather than logging in.
I don't know if you have a view, either Mark or Zoe, on whether Claude is more ethical and transparent than ChatGPT. Has it been successful?
Well, I think there's various ways of, if like, assessing this. And so there has been some studies that have been led by some universities. Sorry if you can't hear at the back, I'll try and speak up. Where they've actually assessed these from various dimensions. And there is no tool at the moment, if you like, passes the highest level of ethics that have been set at the moment. So you go through some of the classic dimensions, such as transparency and other key factors. Everything fails in one regard or another at the moment. So there isn't, if you like, a perfect GPT out there. And of course, some organizations are starting to think, can I strategically use these public models, these general purpose foundation models, do we actually need to create our own data and create our own model so that we can basically make it the way we want it to be?
I mean, we've alluded to the ethical questions around ChatGPT and others. I mean, aside from the fact that it has a horrible lack of English spelling and puts things into Americanism, which is very upsetting. What else should, well, charities in particular, but I suppose everyone engaging in this, be worrying about from an ethical perspective in terms of how these algorithms work, how they've been developed, and how they outwardly face?
I think there's the data privacy angle. It's not something I'm an expert on, but obviously that is a concern. There's the copyright angle, that if some of these tools are harvesting people's work and not giving them recognition. And obviously, like anything charities do, reputational risk is huge. And therefore, the sector has got to be more mindful than perhaps some other sectors of if they get it wrong. So they're basic ethical concerns, but charities, as ever, have got to be possibly more aware of them.
Yeah. Zoe, do you have anything? Yeah.
So one of the things you need to bear in mind is obviously there's a lot of concerns at the moment about people using these tools to write their job applications. And this is something I'm hearing from a lot of charities. Now, there are tools that you can use in order to see if someone has used something like ChatGPT as part of writing their CV or their covering letter. Now, there are two issues with that. Firstly, there's some data to show that if you use these tools, they pick up a lot of false positives, and people who have English as a second language are much more likely to get flagged as having used these tools to create their CVs and the rest of their application. And that could have a lasting effect on someone's life, couldn't it? Because if they are really talented and they could come in and they could transform your charity doesn't want to miss out on them. You don't want them to be flagged as someone who hasn't done something truthfully as part of applying to you. So that's where we would talk about explainability in AI. What are the parameters of this decision? How are we using it as part of making decisions in our charity? And also, to play devil's advocate for a moment, does it matter if they've used these tools to write their CVs and their covering letters? If it's truthful, if it's accurate, if it's persuasive? If we're using these tools in charities to write our Christmas comms campaigns and our social content, why shouldn't people use them for applying for roles with us, provided they edit it, it's truthful, and it gives us a good sense of how they can help us in their new roles?
People lie on CVs all the time.
That's true.
I mean, exactly. I mean, I agree with that, but I mean, I also wonder whether there's a bit of a kind of almost crisis of authenticity brewing, in the sense that in some areas, particularly in the way that charities communicate or use AI or marketing or other contexts, there's start to become a question of whose voice it is that's actually being projected, and to what extent is the charity going to be disclosing the fact it's using AI? To what extent is the way the charity communicates being shifted, put into a different voice by the AI? So I think there's probably going to be quite a lot of thought that needs to be put into that area in the coming years.
And I suppose it's been touched on, this transparency of someone applying to the charity, but what should charities be doing in terms of their transparency about how they use AI? I mean, I've heard, for example, you can have AI generated images, so that could prevent charities having to use beneficiaries in pictures, which can sometimes feel exploitative. But if you're sitting on the tube and you're looking at a picture of your standard international aid poor person in a developing country, and it says this is generated by AI, does that have the same impact? But then if you're not transparent about that, are you being authentic with your donors and your beneficiaries and all your stakeholders?
I think there's a reputational perspective that, so does every message and everything you say need to be human generated? And there's also the risk, though, that you're going to find it more and more difficult over time potentially to know if anybody you're speaking to or communicating to is in fact a person. And so authenticating yourself, if you like, being able to prove that this is me, is probably going to get more and more necessary as time goes on from that perspective as well.
exactly.
I mean, perversely, in a sense, you could imagine it actually getting to a point where it places a greater emphasis on person-to-person communications because of exactly those kind of doubts and uncertainties, which may be something charities reflect on too. That obviously communicating with beneficiaries and others in a digital way is hugely powerful and important, but that human connection is clearly so essential in many charities.
Surely the biggest problem will be for trustees of charities who give grants and donations and stuff is automated AI generated applications for funding. And we already see, well, the charity I work with, a lot of our stuff comes in, it's in manuscript, so that does help us verify that it's actually a physical person, but I could see the thing, you've got to ask the question, is that legitimate? And are we opening ourselves up to a lot of reputational risk by giving grants to maybe the Taliban, to use an example?
I mean, I think you'd always have to have your usual safeguards and due diligence about who you're giving grants to, but I think this kind of question, the Charity Commission, the chair was saying that they're getting applications for charitable status that have been written by ChatGPT. Now, going back to Zoe's question, does that mean they're not a legitimate charity? Or if you are a charity and you are spending hundreds of hours writing grant applications, and I think we all know in the charity sector how much time is wasted sometimes on filling in slightly different forms, is it for that applicant to actually use their resources wisely by using ChatGPT, but then balanced against you as the recipient of that application feeling like you've had an authentic application made?
Yeah, well, my thoughts are that I think risk assessments by their very nature are risky, because it's only as good as the person who thinks of what the question should be that you've got to think about. You need to think about everything. And AI will be only originally, if you go back to basics, is yes, no. Computers just work on the yes, no principle. And I think we're going to have a major problem.
I think your question also talks on the potential fraud risk over time, because clearly if somebody was making a false application for a grant, AI can be used to create all sorts of documents to support that application, which might be very convincing. And if your staff aren't alive to that, the issues and the risk, there are some potential problems there.
It is thinking outside the box, actually thinking. And I don't think, with the greatest respect to the artificial intelligence, they can't actually think, because it's only as good as the person who's writing the code.
I suppose a lot of this leads us to the question of, should charities have an AI policy? And I think the discussions that are being generated shows that yes, you should basically start thinking about this, because even if you're not directly using AI, other people who you interact with will be doing so. I mean, I mentioned at the start that Chris has been developing our AI policy. I mean, what did you start with other than a blank piece of paper in ChatGPT?
Use AI, and then we're circular problems.
Spoiler, I did. Or at least as a starting point, and very helpful it was too. I mean, I think policy is important, but obviously I think it's useful to frame it in a slightly wider context, that equally or arguably more important is setting the culture within the organisation and really thinking hard about who has responsibility and oversight for AI. But within that, yes, clearly a policy is an opportunity to think through the potential applications in your organisation, the particular ethical considerations that matter to you, really emphasising to your staff and others the importance of human oversight and judgment in so much of AI-related work. Obviously, some more technical and legal issues, such as how you manage copyright and data in connection with it. And the other aspect that relates to policies, of course, training and making sure that your staff receive the training and support they need to be able to use AI. I suppose the only other thing I'd add, and certainly was our approach, is to try and set a culture where you encourage people at all levels within your organisation to try and interact with AI in some sense. And there are, in any organisation, invariably a lot of people who are reticent about it, who catastrophise about it, who say, we're not interested, this isn't important, this isn't something we need to be looking at. And I would argue that creates quite a big organisational risk, because if you've got other people, if you're a trustee of a charity and there are people in your organisation that are using ChatGPT and the accounts team or marketing or wherever it might be, or to produce reports and information that's coming to you, and you haven't engaged with it at all, you can't properly oversee that and manage the risks. So yes, the policy is important, but I'd argue the kind of culture and those considerations are more so.
And what stakeholders should charities be potentially engaging with in developing their policy and AI use? Or is this an internal matter, or is this something that you'd be expecting charities to?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the way in which the charity is going to be using AI. Because if it's something relatively straightforward, you're using ChatGPT to make your marketing more efficient, your stakeholders are effectively your staff. Of course, if you're doing something a bit more ambitious along the lines of the projects that Zoe and Mark have outlined, then yes, you may want to sort of involve others, including people with relevant expertise in the area of AI to support you with what you're doing.
I mean, there's having a policy on paper, and obviously I've definitely read our policy. First thing I did, but then there's the putting it into practice. I don't know, particularly Zoe and Mark, you help charities in implementing AI and digital solutions. Do you have any practical tips or advice for people they've got maybe a piece of paper? How do you then take that forwards?
Yes, so I think before you even get anywhere near the piece of paper, you've really got to use it as an exercise to flush out how are people using these tools already, and not with a sense of judgment or stop doing that, but because so much learning, as we've all been saying earlier, is happening by stealth in charities. The amount of charities I've been into where you realise that people are using AI in these corners because they're not sure what they're allowed to do or what they're not allowed to do, what data they can put in these tools, what data they can't put in these tools. So I would see the policy itself almost like a product. So start by doing some research. How are your different teams using these different tools? How's it being used at senior level and also junior level? Get what we would call the use cases, so the different ways in which people are using these tools out in the open so everyone can learn from them. And then you've got some evidence to build your policy on, and you can really ground it in the way that people are using these tools. But what you've also got to bear in mind, exactly as you're saying, is this is a really fast moving area, and the chances are you're going to have to review your AI policy in 6 months' time, maybe sooner, because there'll be new tools coming on the market.
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree with that. It almost feels possibly a little bit too early to lead in with policy at the moment. I think the thing that a lot of organisations need to gain is skills and understanding, and specifically the use cases where they see this being applied. Arguably, internal use cases are inherently less risky than external use cases, for example. And there could be some learnings as well for maybe policies in privacy. Some of the things we know is 3 lines of defence and the idea of a privacy impact assessment, balancing tests. Some of these same mechanisms could potentially be used to support AI policy as well, to help you analyse the risk perspective. There's also a strong innovation play in AI. People want to test, people want to learn, and people want to prove as well. So an AI policy has to allow the organisation to grow as much as manage the risk associated with it. And it's that balancing test that's probably key. It's probably more about governance perhaps than policy.
And did you?
Well, that comes down to trustees as well as staff being fully up to speed with this, and we know from experience that while there are many great trustees, they're not always, as a generalisation.
All the trustees I met are wonderful people.
Yeah, they're wonderful. They're wonderful people, but they might not be applying that wonder to the benefit of their charity all the time. I think we've got a hand up there.
Yeah.
Okay. So in terms of developing a policy as well, I think the wider sort of regulatory framework and legal framework, nationally, internationally, will also influence, what goes into our policies. So absolutely, we're going to be changing quite a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. That was actually what we were going to cover next. Chris, you were next up, because I think what Zoe's saying, you're going to have to review this every 6 months. It's not just that new technologies are going to come onto the market or develop in weird and wonderful ways. It's also, I think, the legal and regulatory framework is going to change exponentially, hopefully, maybe, or maybe they'll continue to not regulate it. But I mean, Chris, are you able to give an overview of what the current system is? Is there one?
Oh yeah, no problem. I'll do it in 30 seconds. It's kind of straightforward. I mean, well, the thing is, it is complicated, isn't it? I mean, you've got to look at it at two levels. You've got to look at it in terms of the regulation of the development of AI and law and regulation that concerns its use. In terms of the regulation of AI, things are very much in their infancy. Certainly in the UK, the government's taking what it describes as sort of an innovation-led approach, which is a sort of wait and see to some extent, in contrast to, for example, the EU in particular, that take a much more proactive approach with its AI Act to regulate those who are creating AI tools. And the US is also a little bit more in line with the EU in terms of perhaps where it's heading. So in the UK, the focus is very much on pushing the emphasis onto existing regulators, for example, to consider how AI needs to be regulated in their area. Whether that sustains, we'll have to see in the UK. It depends on how things might develop. So that's the kind of overall regulation. And whilst that's important, to some extent it doesn't have day-to-day impact on charities. You have to wait and see how things pan out. The other level of law and regulation is, of course, in connection with the use of AI. And that's an area where we're probably going to have to rely on existing law to some extent in areas such as copyright. That's probably going to develop quite quickly through case law and in other ways, also data protection and intellectual property, because in a sense, there's a round peg being pushed into a square hole, that lots of the legislation and law in these areas didn't contemplate these kind of AI developments. Sort of questions might emerge over time about whether AI is capable of being recognised as a legal person that can hold its own copyright. That's not where we are at the moment. I mean, I think taking things to a very practical level, all that charities can probably do at the minute is sort of analyse carefully what they're doing, how they're using AI, and the particular risks that they might identify. Clearly, for example, if you're using ChatGPT to create an outline for a talk that somebody might give, that's a pretty low-risk exercise. It's just creating a structure, some thoughts for you. If you're asking it to create some sort of marketing content, depending on what it's generating, you might need to think whether there could be any copyright type issues. Where does that content come from? Could it be similar to something else? But to some extent, the principles are not dissimilar to content generated in other ways. Somebody in the office comes to you with an image or a design or a trademark or something they've created. You can ask yourself the question, well, actually, do we have the right to use this in the way that the person's proposing? So usual principles apply. It's going to develop quite quickly and it's going to be quite complicated, particularly in areas like data protection. We've got questions about exactly, going back to the sort of transparency points, what's the AI doing? Do you really know where it's getting data from and exactly what it's doing with it?
I think we're very lucky that we've got tech bro Rishi as Prime Minister, who's all over this. No, actually, I think there was something in today's autumn statement. Obviously, as a freelancer, I was more excited about the national insurance thing, which I think means I'm £192 a year better off in future. So you're actually really lucky I turned up tonight.
Don't forget the alcohol freeze. That's.
But there was, I think there was. I have to check the detail. I think it was £500 million for centres of excellence about AI. But I mean, that illustrates, I think, that the government at that level are, well, very much aware of it. I mean, they keep talking about things being world-beating, like they always do, and I'm not quite sure why it needs to be world-beating. It just needs to work. Doesn't need to be, just be operational. But I think there is a sense that this is very much on the radar in government, which is important.
Yeah. And I think the government does come out with its catchphrases, but it feels like they want the UK to be a centre for this type of thing. Yeah. How can charities get involved in that conversation and be part of that development?
Some thoughts on that one. I mean, I think there could be space for new types of charity to be birthed, through these opportunities. I was interested in, there's an organisation called the World Resources Institute, and what they're doing is curating scientifically credible, highly trustworthy data that is being used by various actors in the environmental space, including one called Ocean Watch. and they're using that data to help manage overfishing and predict the health of fishing stocks in the future, as well as coastal erosion. And what you're seeing here is essentially an organisation that's taken it upon himself to curate data that could be then repurposed for AI. And that's a kind of role that perhaps some charities could consider. If you take any social environmental issue in the UK today, any AI is going to be better trained if all those charities with similar causal purpose could get together, share their knowledge, and possibly share the development of such pieces of AI, if it's mission delivery orientated, for example. So there might be new ways for charities to either lead that process or to be created to support this kind of thing. And also, even the big corporate players like Salesforce and Microsoft now have industry clouds for the not-for-profit sector. So if you join those industry clouds, you sign a little form that says, I will share my anonymised data with all my other not-for-profit peers. And that data set can be used to also train AI that will be developed in those clouds and that you can then exploit as being a member of that industry cloud as well. It does, I think, emphasise the value of maybe greater joined-upness and collaboration between organisations.
If the sector's got any, one of the great things about the sector is that there is more collaboration than there arguably could be far more.
Yeah.
But there isn't the competitiveness you'd get in the commercial sector. So that is definitely an area where charities can come together. And presumably, the more that come together and share these things, that will reduce some of the perceived bias as well, because you're getting more and more people feeding into these metrics.
Give those organisations the opportunity to apply their ethics to the development of something and use it in the way that they see fit. Of course, it may not always be used in that way, then it may be gamified by other actors. You can't stop that, but at least the actual development and the tool itself.
Zoe, did you?
So I think this is a really big challenge. And obviously one of the things that came up a lot in the media coverage around Bletchley Park Summit the other week was that there wasn't really a presence for civil society. The voice of charities was missing from the table. And there were some charities there, but not many really. I mean, it was very corporate in many ways. So there are two practical things you can do about this. Firstly, you can talk to the infrastructure bodies and say to them, what are you doing about AI? They are often a really key focal point for convening and getting money into the sector. So if you remember of NCVO, ask them, what are you doing about AI? How are you going to bring charities together around this? So that's the first thing you can do. And the second thing is talk to other charities. And this is why lots of you are here tonight, to find out how you're all using this stuff and learn together. And that's a brilliant way to save time and money and find out how other charities have walked the same path and avoid the pitfalls that they have had to take.
And that's what the sector can do it as a whole. I mean, going back to the mission AI, do we have, while not wanting to be too futuristic, any suggestions of how charities could use AI to really transform the way, not just they're doing their HR job adverts, but how they're actually delivering their purposes?
I can give one slightly scary one, because one of the things that AI does, if you deploy a Microsoft Copilot in your organisation today, it's there and it understands everything that's going on in the digital world, to the extent that if you are invited to a meeting and you don't attend that meeting, it will tell you about that meeting. Okay. Now, if you take that concept further and apply that to every engagement you have with your beneficiaries, every conversation you have digitally with your beneficiaries, every telephone conversation, all of those words is just data to ChatGPT. And that means that you could simply ask ChatGPT, if it was to give an access to that data, how many people have come to me recently? What are the issues they wanted help on? How many people have I helped? How many people achieved their goals? And so from an understanding your constituents and also understanding your impact, a ChatGPT could just give you that data and create stories from that data to help you author your own impact reports. And that's all predicated on your willingness and your beneficiary willingness to engage in these digital conversations and have that shared with your organisational AI. Other more advanced use cases will be have a conversation with your website. Okay, the days of going through your website with a browser could well be dead. You'd have your avatar, and I will talk to your website that understands all the content you've already written, and I'll just ask you questions. Am I eligible for your services? Yes. How do I apply? And so these are kind of two more slightly futuristic, but also achievable within 1 or 2 years if you wanted to use cases.
And also, I guess there's a risk that you could even have almost challenger charities that get established that are really using this to a high extent. If your charity focuses on advocacy, advice, information, you have a website, well, someone can set up a website using AI technologies to provide real-time update information about the particular issue. So it might be worth thinking about how others might do what you're doing if they're starting from scratch, and whether there's anything you can learn from that and integrate into your own organisation.
Yeah, I'm actually a trustee of a local citizens' advice, and that is exactly the discussion we're having at the minute about will there be ways that we can use it to deliver the advice so that it's more 24-hour potentially, but also the challenge of if there's other advice out there that we have got no control over.
Yeah, and possibly another risk there is how do you represent yourself as an avatar? And also, although it may be very factually correct, where's the empathy?
Yeah.
Where's the emotional intelligence? So
very much, yeah, that is a huge part of it, because that's what we've. There was a model that it was partly driven by COVID, where it was a move to more phone advice rather than in person. But sometimes people just want to actually speak to a real person, so yeah, these are all challenges that will be replicated across the sector in lots of different ways.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, I've asked lots of questions, but there's lots of people in the room with lots of different perspectives and coming from different organisations. So I wanted to leave time to open it up to the floor if anyone does have questions. And I know I said, Gordon, if we can cut the filming at this point for the Q&A so that everyone can ask whatever questions you like.
Cut.